Once upon a time there was a king and a queen. They had 3 sons, 2 of which were very bright, but the third was a simpleton. The king had a park in which he kept a variety of wild animals, and into this park a fearful beast came. Norka was its name. It came in and devoured some of every one of the animals every night. The king did all he could, but he was unable to destroy it. So at last he called his sons together and said, "Whoever can destroy this beast, to him I will give half of my kingdom." The eldest son bravely undertook the task. As soon as it was night, he took his weapons and he set out. But before he reached the park, he decided to have a drink in a tavern, and there he spent the whole night in revelry. When he came to his senses, it was already too late. Day had dawned. He felt himself to be disgraced in the eyes of his father, but there was no help for it. So the next day the second son went out, and he did just the same. The father scolded them soundly, and that was the end of it. On the third day the youngest son said he would try. They all laughed him to scorn and said that he was so stupid there was no way he could succeed. But he took his arms and he went straight to the park, and he sat down on the grass in such a position that the moment he went to sleep his weapons would prick him and wake him up. Presently the midnight hour came. The earth began to shake, and the huge Norka came rushing up and burst right through the fence. The prince pulled himself together, leapt to his feet, crossed himself, and went straight at the beast. It fled, and the prince ran after it. He soon saw that he could not catch it on foot, so he hastened to the stable and got a horse, and he went off in pursuit. Presently he caught up with the beast, and they began to fight. They fought, and the prince gave the beast 3 wounds. At last they were both utterly exhausted, so they lay down to take a short rest. But the moment the prince closed his eyes, up jumped the Norka and took flight. The prince's horse awoke him, and up he jumped and set off again in pursuit. Again the prince gave the beast 3 wounds, and then they lay down to rest. Once again the beast took flight as soon as the prince closed his eyes. The prince caught it again and gave it 3 wounds, but all of a sudden, just as the prince began chasing it the 4th time, the beast fled to a great white stone, tilted it up, and disappeared into the other world. He cried out to the prince, "Then only will you overcome me when you enter here." The prince went home and told his father all that had happened. He asked for a leather rope plaited long enough to reach to the other world. His father ordered this to be made. When the rope was made, the prince called for his brothers, and he and they, having taken servants with them, and everything that was needed for a whole year, set out for the place where the beast had disappeared under the stone. When they got there, they built a palace on the spot, and they lived in it for some time. But when everything was ready, the youngest brother said to the others, "Now, brothers, who is going to lift this stone?" Neither of them could so much as stir the stone, but as soon as the youngest touched it, he threw it quite a distance, though it was ever so big, big as a hill. And when he had flung the stone aside, he spoke a second time to his brothers, and he asked, "Who is going into the other world to overcome the Norka?" Neither of them offered to do it. Then he laughed at them for being such cowards, and he said, "Well, brothers, farewell. Lower me into the other world, and don't go away from here, but as soon as you feel the cord jerked, pull me up." His brothers lowered him accordingly, and when he had reached the other world, underneath the earth, he went on his way. He walked and walked. Presently he spied a horse with rich trappings, and it said to him, "Hail, Prince Ivan, long have I awaited thee." He mounted the horse and rode. He rode and rode until he saw standing before him a palace made of copper. He entered the courtyard, tied up his horse, and went indoors. In one of the rooms a dinner was laid out. He sat down and dined, and then went into a bedroom. There he found a bed on which he lay down to rest. Presently there came in a lady more beautiful than can be imagined anywhere but a fairy tale, and she said to him, "Thou who art in my house, name thyself." If thou art an old man, thou shalt be my father. If a middle-aged man, my brother. If a young man, thou shalt be my husband dear. And if thou art a woman, and an old one, thou shalt be my grandmother. A middle-aged one, my mother. And a girl, thou shalt be my sister. Thereupon he came forth, and when she saw him, she was delighted with him. O Prince Ivan, my husband dear thou shalt be. Wherefore hast thou come hither? Then he told her all that had happened, and she said, That beast which thou wishest to overcome is my brother. He is staying just now with my second sister, who lives not far from here in another palace. It is made of silver. They had a drink and enjoyed themselves, and they held sweet converse together, and then the prince took leave of her and went to the second sister's house, the one who lived in the silver palace, and with her he also stayed a while. She told him that her brother Norka was just then at her youngest sister's. So he went to the youngest sister's, who lived in a golden palace. She told him that her brother was at that time asleep on the blue sea, and she gave him a sword of steel and a draught of the water of strength. And she told him to cut off her brother's head at a single stroke. And when he heard these things, he went on his way. And when the prince came to the blue sea, he looked, and there slept the Norka on a stone in the middle of the sea. And when it snored, the water was agitated for 7 miles around. The prince crossed himself, went up to it, and smote it on the head with his sword. The head jumped off, saying all the while, Well, I'm done for now, and it rolled off far away into the sea. After killing the beast, the prince went back again, picking up all 3 sisters along the way, with the intention of taking them out into the upper world, for they all loved him and would not be separated from him. Each of them turned her palace into an egg, for each of them were enchantresses, and they taught him how to turn the egg into a palace and back again, and then they handed the eggs over to him. Then they all went to the place from which they had to be hoisted up into the outer world. And when they came to where the rope was, the prince took hold of it, and he tied the maidens fast to it. Then he jerked at the rope, and his brothers began to haul it up. And when they had hauled it up, and they set eyes on the wondrous maidens, they went together and held counsel, and said, Let's lower the rope, pull our brother part of the way up, and then cut the rope. Perhaps he'll be killed. It's the only way that we'll get these beauties as wives. So when they had agreed upon this, they lowered the rope. But the brother was no fool. He guessed what they were up to, so he fastened the rope to a stone, and then he gave it a pull. His brothers hoisted the stone to a great height, and then they cut the rope. Down fell the stone, and it broke into pieces. The prince cried many tears over the faithlessness of his brothers, and then he went away. He walked and he walked. Presently a storm arose. Lightning flashed, the thunder roared, the rain fell in torrents. He went up to a tree in order to take shelter under it, and on that tree he saw some young birds who were being thoroughly drenched. So he took off his coat and he covered them with it, and he himself sat down under the tree. Presently there came flying a bird, such a big one that all the light was blotted out by it. Now this was the mother of the small birds which the prince had covered up. And when the bird had come flying up and perceived that her little ones were covered and safe, she said, Who has wrapped up my nestlings? And presently, seeing the prince, she asked, Didst thou do that? Thank you. In return, ask anything of me that thou desirest, and I will do anything for thee. Then carry me into the outer world, he replied. Make me a large vessel with a partition in the middle, she said. Catch all sorts of game and put them into one half of it, and the other half pour water. That way there shall be meat and drink for me. All this the prince did, and then the bird, having taken the vessel on his back with the prince sitting in the middle of it, began to fly. After flying some distance, she brought him to his journey's end, took leave of him, and flew away back. But he went to the house of a certain tailor and engaged himself as his servant. So much the worse for wear was he, so thoroughly had he altered in appearance, that no one would have suspected that he was the prince. Having entered into the service of a master, the prince began to ask what was going on in that country. His master replied, "Our two princes, for the third has disappeared, have brought away brides from the other world, and they want to marry them. But the brides refuse, for they insist on having all their wedding clothes made for them first, exactly like the ones which they had in the other world, and that without being measured first. The king has called all the workmen together, but not one of them will undertake to do it." The prince, having heard this, said, "Go to the king, master, and tell him that you will provide everything that is in your line to do." "How can I undertake to make clothes of that sort? I work for common folk," said his master. "Go along, master, I will answer for everything," said the prince. So the tailor went. The king was delighted that at least one good workman had been found. He gave him as much money as he wanted. When the tailor had settled everything, he went home, and the prince said to him, "Now then, pray to God, and lie down to sleep. Tomorrow all will be ready." And the tailor followed the advice, and he went to bed. Midnight sounded. The prince arose, went out of the city and into the fields. He took out of his pocket the eggs which the maidens had given him, and as they had taught him, he turned them into the 3 palaces. Into each of these he entered, took the maidens' robes, went out again, and turned the palaces back into eggs, and then went home. And when he got there, he hung up the robes on the wall and lay down to sleep. Early in the morning his master awoke, and behold, there hung such robes as he had never seen before, shining with gold and silver and precious stones. He was delighted. He seized them and carried them off to the king. When the princesses saw that the clothes were those which had been theirs in the other world, they knew Prince Ivan was there in this world, so they exchanged glances with each other, but held their peace. And the master, having handed over the clothes, went home, but he no longer found his dear apprentice there, for the prince had gone to the shoemaker's, and him too he sent to work for the king. And in the same way he went around to all the workers, till the princesses had all of their clothing, and all of the workmen loved Prince Ivan, as through him they had all become enriched. Now that the princesses had received all that they asked for, all their clothes were just like what they had had in the other world. They had to fulfill their bargain. They wept bitterly because the prince had not come, and it was impossible for them to hold out any longer. It was necessary that they get married. But when they were ready for the wedding, the youngest bride said to the king, "Allow me, my father, to go and give alms to the beggars." He gave her permission, and she went and began bestowing alms upon the beggars. Each one she examined closely. When she came to one, and she was about to hand him money, she got sight of the ring which she had given to the prince in the other world, and her sister's ring too, for it really was he. So she seized him by the hand and brought him into the hall, and she said to the king, "Here is he who brought us out of the other world. His brothers forbade us to say that he was alive, threatening to kill us if we did." Then the king was wroth with those sons, and he punished them as he thought best. And thus afterwards 3 weddings were celebrated.